Picture a woman who had brought 43 healthy babies into the world with her bare hands, reducing maternal mortality in her village to almost zero, only to be dragged before the Inquisition and accused of making pacts with demons. Imagine someone who had saved dozens of mothers from death in childbirth, suddenly branded as a servant of Satan because her success rate seemed impossible without supernatural intervention. This is the true story of Bridget Bishop, the midwife of Salem Village, whose extraordinary skill at delivering babies alive became evidence of witchcraft that would ultimately lead her to the gallows. What happened to Bridget reveals how the very act of saving lives could become a death sentence when women's knowledge threatened the established order of church and medicine. Before we uncover how healing became heresy in colonial America, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because Bridget's story shows how expertise could be more dangerous than ignorance in Puritan New England. Bridget Bishop had been delivering babies in Salem Village for over 20 years by 1692, building a reputation as the most skilled midwife in Massachusetts Bay Colony through her remarkable ability to save both mothers and children during the dangerous ordeal of childbirth. In an era when 1 in 10 women died giving birth and infant mortality rates exceeded 50%, Bridget's track record was nothing short of miraculous. 43 successful deliveries without losing a single mother or child. Born around 1632, Bridget had learned her trade from her mother and grandmother, inheriting generations of accumulated knowledge about childbirth, herbal remedies, and women's health that had been passed down through oral tradition rather than formal medical training. Her education came from experience, observation, and an intuitive understanding of the birthing process that allowed her to intervene successfully in complications that typically proved fatal. Bridget's methods combined traditional midwifery techniques with innovations that she had developed through years of practical experience. She knew how to reposition breached babies in the womb, how to stop dangerous bleeding through the application of specific herbal preparations, and how to revive newborns who appeared stillborn through techniques that seemed to bring them back from the dead. Her knowledge of pain management using various plants and tinctures made her deliveries less traumatic for mothers while maintaining their safety. The social dynamics of Bridget's work placed her at the center of Salem Village's most intimate and vulnerable moments. She was called to attend births at all hours of the day and night, often spending days with laboring mothers while providing not just medical care, but emotional support and spiritual comfort during their ordeal. Her presence at births made her a keeper of family secrets and a witness to the private struggles of Salem's women. Bridget's success had made her indispensable to Salem Village's female community, but it had also created tensions with the male-dominated medical and religious establishments. The colony's few trained physicians, educated in European medical schools, resented being consistently outperformed by an uneducated woman whose methods defied their theoretical understanding of anatomy and disease. Puritan ministers were suspicious of her knowledge of herbal remedies and her ability to ease pain, which they believed should be endured as God's punishment for Eve's sin. The economic implications of Bridget's work also created conflict within the community. Successful deliveries meant larger families, which required more resources and created competition for land and inheritance. Some families began to whisper that Bridget's ability to ensure healthy births was giving certain lineages unfair advantages in building wealth and influence through population growth. Perhaps most dangerously, Bridget's confidence and independence challenged Puritan expectations about women's proper roles in society. She moved freely through the community at all hours, made medical decisions without consulting male authorities, and commanded respect from grateful families who credited her with saving their loved ones. Her autonomy and expertise made her a target for those who believed that such capabilities in a woman could only come from diabolic sources. By 1692, the combination of professional jealousy, religious suspicion, and social tensions had created a dangerous situation where Bridget's very success as a midwife had become evidence against her in the eyes of those who viewed unexplained female competence as proof of witchcraft. The transformation of Bridget Bishop from beloved midwife to suspected witch began with the very successes that had made her invaluable to Salem Village's women. As community leaders struggled to explain how an uneducated woman could consistently achieve medical results that surpassed those of university-trained physicians. The outbreak of witchcraft accusations in Salem during early 1692 created an atmosphere where Bridget's extraordinary abilities suddenly seemed sinister rather than beneficial. The first accusations against Bridget came from Reverend Samuel Parris, who had grown increasingly suspicious of her influence over the women in his congregation. Parris pointed out that Bridget's success rate was statistically impossible without supernatural assistance, arguing that her ability to save mothers and babies who should have died according to God's will represented an interference with divine providence that could only come from diabolic sources. The Puritan theology that dominated Salem Village taught that pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, and that high mortality rates reflected divine judgment on a sinful world. Bridget's ability to reduce both suffering and death challenged this theological framework and suggested that she possessed knowledge that contradicted God's plan for human suffering. Her use of herbal pain remedies was particularly suspect, as it seemed to circumvent the spiritual purification that was supposed to come through enduring labor pains. Medical authorities, led by Dr. William Griggs, provided seemingly scientific support for the accusations against Bridget by testifying that her methods had no basis in accepted medical knowledge. Dr. Griggs argued that Bridget's techniques for repositioning babies, reviving seemingly stillborn infants, and controlling bleeding were beyond the capabilities of natural medicine and must therefore rely on supernatural intervention. The most damning evidence against Bridget came from her own patients, as the climate of fear created by the witch trials pressured women to reinterpret their experiences with her care. Mothers who had once praised Bridget's skill now recalled suspicious details about her behavior during their deliveries. Her ability to predict complications before they became apparent. Her uncanny knowledge of each baby's condition while still in the womb, and her success in reviving children who appeared to be born dead. Goodwife Sarah Wilds, whose difficult delivery Bridget had managed successfully 2 years earlier, testified that the midwife had whispered strange words during the birth and applied mysterious substances that seemed to have unnatural effects. What Sarah had once interpreted as skilled medical care, she now described as evidence of magical intervention that had saved her baby through demonic assistance. The accusations gained momentum when several of Salem's afflicted girls, the young women whose supposed supernatural torments had triggered the witch trials, claimed that Bridget's specter had visited them in the night. They testified that her ghostly form had attempted to recruit them as her accomplices in diabolic activities, offering them the same supernatural knowledge that had made her so successful as a midwife. Reverend Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister who served as theological advisor to the Salem witch trials, declared that Bridget's case proved how Satan could use seemingly beneficial activities to corrupt and deceive godly communities. He argued that her success in delivering babies was actually evidence of her effectiveness as a diabolic agent, since the devil preferred to work through people whose good reputation would shield them from suspicion. Bridget Bishop's trial before the court of Oyer and Terminer in June 1692 became a showcase for how Puritan theology and legal procedure could transform a lifetime of healing into evidence of diabolic conspiracy, as prosecutors systematically reinterpreted every aspect of her midwifery practice as proof of supernatural malevolence. The proceedings were presided over by Judge William Stoughton, who had already decided that spectral evidence and theological arguments would carry more weight than actual facts about Bridget's medical work. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Dr. William Griggs, who explained to the court why Bridget's success rate was medically impossible without supernatural assistance. He described normal 17th century childbirth mortality rates and argued that Bridget's ability to consistently save both mothers and babies represented a deviation from natural law that could only be explained by diabolic intervention. Her knowledge of anatomy and physiology, which exceeded what an uneducated woman should possess, was presented as evidence that she had received forbidden knowledge from demonic sources. Cotton Mather took the stand to provide theological justification for the charges against Bridget, explaining how Satan could use apparently beneficial activities to advance his agenda of corrupting human souls. He argued that Bridget's success in reducing childbirth mortality was actually a form of spiritual warfare against God's plan for human suffering, and that her pain-relieving remedies represented an attempt to circumvent the divine punishment that women were supposed to endure for Eve's sin. The most devastating testimony came from women who had once been grateful for Bridget's care, but were now pressured to reinterpret their experiences in light of the witchcraft accusations. Mary Warren testified that during her difficult labor, Bridget had demonstrated impossible knowledge about the baby's condition and position, accurately predicting complications that weren't yet visible. What Mary had once seen as remarkable skill, she now described as evidence of supernatural perception. Sarah Good, another of Bridget's former patients, claimed that the midwife had used mysterious substances and spoken in strange languages during her delivery. She testified that Bridget had applied herbal preparations that had unusual effects and had performed procedures that seemed to violate the natural order of childbirth. The prosecution argued that these were clear signs of magical practices disguised as medical care. The afflicted girls provided the most theatrical testimony, claiming that Bridget's specter continued to torment them even during the trial. They writhed and screamed when she was brought into the courtroom, insisting that her ghostly form was attacking them and attempting to force them to sign the devil's book. Their dramatic performances convinced many observers that Bridget possessed supernatural powers that she was using to harm innocent victims. Bridget's attempts to defend herself only strengthened the prosecution's case against her. When she tried to explain her medical techniques and the natural basis for her herbal remedies, the court interpreted her knowledge as evidence of forbidden learning that no ordinary woman should possess. Her confidence in describing her methods was seen as proof of the pride and defiance that the devil inspired in his servants. The court's verdict was predetermined by the theological and legal framework that governed the Salem witch trials. Bridget Bishop was guilty of practicing witchcraft through her work as a midwife, and the penalty for such crimes was death by hanging. Bridget Bishop became the first victim of the Salem witch trials when she was hanged on June 10, 1692. Her death marking not just the end of a skilled healer's life, but the beginning of a systematic campaign to destroy women's traditional medical knowledge and replace it with male-dominated institutional medicine. Her execution on Gallows Hill served as a warning to other women who possessed healing skills that their expertise could become evidence against them in the religious and political climate of Puritan New England. The morning of her execution, Bridget maintained the dignity and composure that had characterized her throughout the trial, refusing to confess to crimes she had never committed, even when offered the possibility of reprieve in exchange for naming other supposed witches. Her final words from the scaffold were a declaration of innocence and a prayer asking God to forgive those who were about to take her life for the crime of helping women survive childbirth. Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who presided over the execution, used Bridget's death as an opportunity to warn Salem's remaining midwives about the dangers of exceeding their proper roles as women. He declared that her fate proved how Satan could corrupt women who sought knowledge and authority beyond what God had ordained for their sex, and that her exceptional abilities had been evidence of diabolic pride rather than natural skill. The immediate aftermath of Bridget's execution created a climate of terror among Salem's women, particularly those who possessed medical knowledge or served as midwives. Several other skilled healers fled the area rather than risk being the next targets of witchcraft accusations, while others deliberately reduced their effectiveness to avoid seeming too successful in their medical practice. The impact on Salem Village's maternal and infant mortality rates was swift and devastating. Without Bridget's expertise, and with other midwives afraid to use their full knowledge, the death rates during childbirth returned to the typical colonial levels that Bridget had worked so hard to reduce. The community that had executed her for being too successful in saving lives now faced the consequences of losing the skills that had protected their women and children. The broader implications of Bridget's execution extended far beyond Salem Village, as her case became a precedent for prosecuting women whose medical knowledge challenged male authority in colonial America. Her death sent a clear message that women's traditional healing practices would no longer be tolerated by religious and medical establishments seeking to consolidate their control over healthcare and community life. Modern historical analysis reveals that Bridget Bishop's techniques and knowledge were actually advanced applications of medical principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by European medicine for decades. Her understanding of antiseptic practices, pain management, and emergency obstetric procedures placed her far ahead of her contemporaries. But this expertise made her dangerous in a society that equated female competence with diabolic conspiracy. The tragedy of Bridget Bishop's execution lies not just in the injustice of her individual death, but in the systematic destruction of women's medical knowledge that her case represented. The Salem witch trials effectively ended the tradition of skilled female healers who had served their communities for generations, replacing them with male physicians whose training was often inferior to the practical knowledge they helped destroy. Bridget's grave remained unmarked for centuries, another attempt to erase the memory of women whose only crime was being too good at saving lives. The next time you visit a modern hospital and see skilled nurses and midwives saving lives, remember Bridget Bishop, a woman who was executed for doing exactly the same thing 3 centuries ago. Her story reminds us that progress isn't always linear, and that expertise can be more dangerous than ignorance when it challenges the wrong people at the wrong time. If this tragic tale of medical skill, punished as witchcraft, opened your eyes to how knowledge has been weaponized against women throughout history, smash that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories of women destroyed by their own abilities, and hit that notification bell, because the most important lessons come from remembering those who died for being ahead of their time. What other historical medical practices do you think were unfairly persecuted as witchcraft? Share your thoughts in the comments below.